So, Lehan was fantastic, so you're going to have to forgive me. He set the bar very high from a talking standpoint. And I also put some speaker notes on there so I kind of could sort of remember what I was going to talk about, but I can't see them, so I'll kind of wing it as I go along. So welcome. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk to you about information systems architecture. Now, architecture is a funny beast, and Igor knows what I'm talking about. You heard me talk before. Information systems architecture is a funny beast because anybody who's worked with an architect will tell you that they know a good architect when they see it, but nobody really knows what a good architect is a lot of the time. Like, if I talk to people and go, well, what makes a good architect? People will give you a different answer every single time. But first of all, I just want to check. When I talk about information systems architecture, does everybody know what I mean? Like, is there anybody in the audience? Like, feel free to put up your hand. If I go, information systems architecture, does everyone kind of have a sense of what an architect actually does? No, there's a few people shaking their heads. Okay, so let me explain. So an information systems architect, is usually the person that kind of understands how everything joins up from end to end in an organization where ICT systems are concerned. So it's the architect is the one that typically will understand the big picture, and it's the architect that is usually called into big change projects to be involved in change of systems, things that are going on, and usually the ones that are making the kind of the major decisions around technology and being looked to help ensure that the most optimal decisions are being made when organizations are choosing their tech. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about architecture in terms of trade-offs, because in the ICT world, most things where you're making decisions are a trade-off from one thing to another. So from an architecture standpoint, I quite like that idea of thinking in terms of trade-offs, and in terms of what makes a good architect, there's kind of a spectrum of different things that and ways of comparing different positions that you can take on things. That's not a bad way to think about architecture. So without further ado, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the trade-off between abstraction and details. So when my business partners and I first started our company about 9 years ago, we did some work for an engineering company downtown, and we duly went in there and followed like architecture best practice. We collected lots of information. We gave them a beautiful roadmap at the end of that exercise, and they said they were happy with it. But I have to admit, when I look at it in hindsight now, I kind of wonder whether it was really as good as what we thought it was at the time. And the reason why is because actually we fell into the trap of spending, I think, far too much detail time trying to understand lots and lots of information and try to kind of collate it up into like this perfect mammoth document that no one ever reads. So anyone that's spent time with architects know that architects love to write big long documents a lot of the time, and then nobody reads them. So I guess there's always this balance that's going on between abstraction and details, and a good architect will try to find the right balance between those things, because ultimately if the more abstract that you make things, the easier it is to kind of convey something to someone. But actually the devil's in the detail a lot of the time as well. So trying to find a balance between those things is important. So that's topic number one. So this quote here, hopefully what you can tell that this one is about is related to idealism versus pragmatism. So I think if we were talking before, I think both Lehan and Karma talked about the rate of change. I think everybody can agree that the rate of change has never been faster than what it is at the moment. And the problem with that from an architecture standpoint is that it tends to lead to this ruthless form of kind of pragmatism that takes place. And agile, I'm sure most of you would have heard of agile as a thing, kind of in terms of software development and the way that systems get implemented and so forth. Agile is like the ultimate kind of instrument for pragmatism. It's all about short-term, kind of get stuff across the line, make things happen. But from an architecture standpoint, that can be problematic, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that in the longer term that you're actually trying to make the right long-term decisions, not just lots of short-term things that can oftentimes be counteractive and put you in the wrong place in the longer term. The problem with idealism, the other side of the equation, is that architects can be known from time to time to be a bit idealistic. Software engineers, I tend to be the kind of the worst where that is concerned, because oftentimes I've been on the end of poor decisions, and they kind of want to create the perfect solution. And to be honest, there's no perfect solution. So I guess the trick from an architecture standpoint is to try to find that balance between idealism and pragmatism. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is risk, and essentially uncertainty versus certainty. Usually that topic is the domain of project managers in the world of kind of change in IT, is usually where people think about it. Or it might be the CIO or the CTO, but usually that's more of an operational kind of a context, right? So the CIO and the CTO will be reasonably obsessed with the risk associated with the infrastructure that's going on in their organization. But they'll often be divorced from the details of the kind of technology change. And that's where architects usually come into the picture, or should come into the picture. So a good architect is going to have a really good working knowledge of risk and how to deal with that in a technology context. So a good example of this is a couple of years ago, I did a piece of consulting work for a manufacturing company. And that manufacturing company had an ERP solution that was on some outdated hardware that needed to be replaced. And so we got called in by one of the directors on the board, and they were going, well, really, shouldn't we be thinking about the cloud? That, the IT manager wants us to just upgrade that hardware and kind of leave it where it is. So I came in and had a look at what they were doing. And what I did was I applied a framework called Open Fair. So Open Fair is a very structured way of thinking about risk. And essentially what it does is it gives you a framework to quantify things, so that you can think about impact, you can think about the likelihood of things happening, you apply dollars to things, and then you can weigh things up and try to decide what the best approach is. And lo and behold, when I looked at the cost of what it was going to take for them to move to the cloud and to operate on the cloud, and compare it to what if they upgraded their hardware locally, even though there were a bunch of risks with upgrading the hardware on the local side of things, it actually turned out to be a better option for them, because the likelihood was quite low. The impact, even though they could be out for a day or two, but they could operate quite successfully without the ERP. And so ultimately it made more sense to stick with the hardware that was on site, as opposed to moving to the cloud, which was kind of an unintuitive place to be, because pretty much anything that you read these days goes move it to the cloud. So this one is about specialism versus generalism. So one of the things with architects is that oftentimes in organizations, architects are kind of seen as being the kind of expert in the room, the kind of smartest guy, that kind of understands how everything works and everything fits together. And there's a really, for architects, that is, it's a really comfortable place to be. And it's actually quite an important role for the architect to play from time to time. But I'm actually of the firm opinion that the best architects are actually generalists, not specialists. Because to do architecture well, you have to have a really broad view of technology. You can't just be this kind of specialist person that sits there and just focuses on your one little area. A good architect is taking into account a whole bunch of different things and trying to take a balanced view of the world. So I don't have a framework on this one to talk about in terms of how to strike the right balance between specialism versus generalism. The only thing I would say is that good architects will spend a lot of time learning and continuing to kind of upskill themselves and keeping their knowledge up to date. So this is one of my favorite topics, is modeling, and so one of the things that I've talked about a couple of times in here, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more, is kind of frameworks that you can use. And most frameworks are built around a model. And in the world of kind of information systems architecture, one of the things that architects love doing is building models of how everything fits together. Because the fact of the matter is that in most organizations, you have a very complex landscape of systems and lots of different things that you've got to take account of. So if you can build a model that is somewhat accurate, then you can kind of make sense of it. Now, most people, when they think of models in a sort of ICT architecture standpoint, think of the diagrams that are created. And the diagrams are a necessary output of what we create. But actually, a model is much deeper than that. A model is something that lets you work through a problem. The model is something that, if you do it well and you capture the information appropriately, can act as a knowledge base so that you can go back and understand the impact of change. So models are a really, really important tool from an architecture standpoint. But they can also be quite seductive. And what I mean by that is you can just keep on building out the model and trying to create the perfect model and trying to get that model like as perfect as possible so that it reflects like the real world. But as the statement up there, right, all models are wrong, but kind of some are useful. So when you hit that point where you've created a model that is so detailed that you're not getting any value out of it anymore, that's definitely the time to stop. Now, if you're interested in the modeling side of things from an architecture standpoint, some of you might have heard of UML if you're in the software engineering kind of side of things. If you're more around business process and the business side of things, then you've got a BPMN, which is like a business process modeling language. My favorite modeling tool, though, or modeling language, is a tool called Archimate. Archimate is an enterprise architecture modeling language, and it basically lets you model everything from organizational strategy, so that all those questions around why, down into the technology, and also lets you link into things like projects, and even lets you model real-world things like resources and equipment and that kind of thing as well. So, there is one thing that I have a bit of a pet peeve about, and I'm just about at the end, and that is where it has to do with organisations that have a favourite kind of solution or a system, and then every answer becomes that system. And this is the worst problem that I see over and over again in different organizations. And again, it's one of those it's kind of a laziness thing. It's kind of it's just one of those things that happens, right? You get in something like a Salesforce.com. For those who know Salesforce.com, it's like this kind of Uber platform that does all these different things. You bring it in to solve a particular problem. You have a couple of people that become really expert in it. And then all of a sudden, Salesforce.com is the answer to every single problem in the organization, even when it is not actually the best, most effective answer for that problem. There may be a better solution out there for it. The way to get around that is to be aware of context, right? So if you haven't figured out that the point of this picture here is just that you don't understand the context that's ended up with that guy on his head over there. So context is key. Context is the critical thing when it comes to architecture, in fact. So all of those comparisons that I was making between things from abstraction to details and so forth, it's actually context that lets you set where you should be appropriately on those things. So there are a couple of frameworks again that can help you set your context correctly. One is this one here. Does anybody recognize this? Yeah. So this is from I think he was a major in the US Army, and I'm trying to remember it. John Booth, wasn't it? John Boyd. He was a fighter pilot, and what he did was he came up with this framework, which was a very generalized kind of framework for kind of looking at a situation and then figuring out how to make a decision, essentially. So observe, orient, decide, act are the four key parts to it, and there's quite a lot more detail underneath it. It gets referred to as the OODA loop quite a lot, and it's well worth going and have a bit of a read about Wikipedia if you're interested. The other person, there's an enterprise architect. He's an English guy. I think he's in Australia at the moment, actually. A guy called Tom Graves. who's pretty well known in enterprise architecture circles. He has this this framework here, which was all about thinking in terms of what's simple, complicated, ambiguous, and kind of not known chaos. So it was quite interesting listening to Lihan before talking about chaos as well. Because the point of this framework is, and again, all his stuff is out on the web. It's easy to go and find. Basically, what he's saying is that when you reach the point of now, you need things to be simple. Otherwise, it's impossible to make a decision. The further out in the future, the more uncertain you are. And so things become not known, and they become kind of unknowable, really. And so depending on which way you're moving, depends on the type of the type of where you're at, I suppose, and the type of decision that you should be trying to make. So, to finish, look at that, 38 seconds. These are the sort of the kind of topics that I've talked about all the way through, and really the point is that there is no one right answer. It's always about context, and context is the thing that will help you figure out whether you should be at the abstraction end or whether you should be at the details end of the equation. And really, from an architecture standpoint, for me, those are the kind of the key kind of things that if you take away all of the things around the technical things that architects know, those types of that type of thinking about those types of things is really what makes a really good architect, as opposed to someone who just knows lots of stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.